Chompman, Games Without Code. Created for developers of all levels and based on the beloved classic arcade game Pac-Man, this project was created to be an easy to follow step-by-step guide that would give you the tools, techniques, and experience of creating a full game from start to finish. All the game assets, textures, UI, and effects were created from scratch, and we're giving them to you for free. So if you wish to follow along step by step, you can download the Chompman project files from the links in the description or from the Unity Asset Store. In this Games Without Code with Bolt video, we'll not only show you how to set up the enemy character, but we'll also create a dynamic floating effect and create a state machine that allows us to dynamically change colors all based on a single material. So to begin, we're going to bring in our ghost characters. So the ghost characters can be found in our Chomp folder under Mesh, Characters, and there's our Ghost Mesh. So we can see under our Ghost Mesh we have two attributes. So since for this character we won't be using the animator either, we can remove the animator component. And let's also tag this character while we have it selected. So let's go to our tag. For our ghost character, we want to tag that enemies, which is not a default within Unity. So we're going to click add tags. And once we click add tags, we can see that it's brought us to our tags and layer window in the inspector. So to add a tag, we can go under our tags and we can click the plus button. And then we can type in our tag. So we're going to tag this one enemy. So once we have it tagged, we can select our characters and we can see it untagged. So we can go under our tags and now we can see that we have our enemy tag that we can select for our characters. So we're going to select that as enemy. So if we go under our materials, we can see that we have the elements of our ghost material. So one of the things that we're going to be doing to change the color of our ghost is, instead of changing the albedo, if we click in our emissions, if we go into our material folder, our textures folder, we can see that we have several emissive colors. We can see that we have our blue, which is for when our ghost is scared, our light blue, orange, pink, and red. And if we drag one of these into our emissions, we can see that we now have that orange ghost. But before we create that, let's first create our blend shape that we're going to be using for this ghost. So to create the wind flowing effect, if we go to our mesh renders, we can see that we have a blend shape for this ghost. So before we demonstrate that, let's first move this camera a bit closer. So if we look at our blend shapes, we move our blend shapes, we can see that it moves our sheet up and down, which is going to create that dynamic kind of flowing movement within our sheets. So the first thing we're going to do is let's create that dynamic flowing effect with our blend shapes. And since this is going to be using many of the same things that we did with our Chomp character, what we can do is use the state machine from our Chomp character for our ghost characters as well. So first, let's create the state machine on our ghost character. So we're going to go to add component and we're going to search state. And we're just going to add that state machine, which is going to add our state machine component as well as our variable component. So let's first create a new macro for our ghost. And we're going to create that. We're going to save that into the folder that we created in our last lesson, our macros folder. And we're just going to call this ghost macro. And we're just going to save that. So we can see once we save our ghost macro that we now have our state machine visible within our graph. So we're going to grab our Chomp prefabs, which is in our prefab folders, characters, and our Chomp character, and bring that into our scene. And the reason we're doing this is we're going to grab the state machine from our Chomp character, which is going to save us a lot of time, since this is using many of the same states that we're going to need for our ghost character as well. So if you didn't see our last Bolt video, we recommend that you watch that, since it goes into great detail of the many things that we did within that state machine. So what we're going to do with our Chomp character selected is we're going to go into our Blink Super state that we created in our last video. We're going to grab all these and we're just going to hit Control-C to copy these over. And within our ghost state, what we're going to do is we're going to remove our start and we're going to right click and we're going to create a super state. And with our super state created, let's rename this to Blendshapes. And once we have that renamed, we're going to double click and go within our super state. And we're going to select our start state, and we're just going to paste the states from the Chomp character. So once we have that pasted, we can delete our Chomp prefab, and let's go back into our super state. And so let's start by going into our start state. So if we look on our Ghost character, we can see that unlike our Chomp character, we have our skin mesh render on the mesh itself. So the first thing we can do is we can remove the get child nodes. So additionally, one of the things that we need to do is we need to change our scene variables because we don't want them to affect any of our other characters, and we're going to change these into object variables. So we're going to create a variable called Ghost, and we're going to create another variable called Ghost Mesh Renderer. So within our set variables, we're going to change that from scene, and we're going to change that to object, and we're going to change that to ghost. And we're going to do the same with our other set variable, and we're going to change that to ghost mesh renderer. So next, let's start by renaming our states. So we're going to select our blinking, and we're going to rename this to sheet up. And we're going to rename our other one to sheet down. Next, let's go into our sheet up state. And within the state, we don't really need to do much besides change our variables that we have in here. So we're going to go to our variables, and let's create float variables for the blink speed and the blink weight. So we're going to call the first sheet weight, and we're going to call the other one sheet speed. And if we remember from the last video that unlike our game object variable as well as our skin mesh render variable, that our float variables will retain its variable type once it's set. We also want to use our ghost variable. And now let's go into our first transition. And let's create our min sheet weight. Set that to a float, and that's going to be 0. And for this one, we don't need a pause. We're going to remove our pause in our weight. And let's go back and go to our sheet down state. Go to our last transition. And let's create our max sheet weight, and we're going to set that to a float, and that max is 100 since that is the maximum amount for our blend shape. So let's set our sheet speed. So we're going to set our sheet speed to be fairly low. So let's try out about 50. So before we hit play, let's go through all this logic. So we can see once it starts, it's going to grab itself and set itself as the ghost object variable. Once it does that, it's going to get the skin mesh render component, and then it's going to set our, and we can change this as well. So let's change this into our ghost mesh renderer. So it's going to get set that as our ghost mesh renderer variable. Once it gets that, it's going to use our delta time, and it's going to multiply that by our sheet speed time, which we set, and then it's going to add that into itself, and it is going to adjust our blend shape value with the sheet weight value. And the sheet down is going to do that same thing, but it's going to subtract that value. So instead of going from 0 to 100, it's going to go from 100 back to 0. And our transitions will fire once the sheet weight meets the max sheet weight. Once it is greater than that, it will go and set that as true, and it will fire our transition. And the same with our other transition, it is just set to do our min sheet weight. So once that equals 0 or is less than 0, it will set that to true, and it will go back to our sheet up state. So let's hit play. So in play, we can see our values of our sheet weight, as well as the floating effect that it's using, that our blend shape is somewhat simulating. So we can set that to about 30. And once the character is moving, it has this floating effect as if the sheet is moving as well. We can test out different speeds. 30 seems to be a good speed. But again, during gameplay, we can always adjust these numbers. So now that we have our sheet blend shape done, we can move on to setting the character's material. So first, let's go into our start state, and we want to create another variable, and we want this variable to be for our ghost material. So we're going to call this variable ghost orange, and it with matte, so it's for our materials. And just like our game object and many other variables within Bolt, it is not hard coded. So if we go and we set this to be a material type variable and hit play, we can see that it quickly switches to null. And even if we go back in play mode, it is null as well. So we want to start this by going into our unit and going under the ghost mesh, and we're going to go skin render, and we're going to go to get material. So once we have our get material, we're going to go and we're going to add a set material. Next, we need a set material texture value. So we want to set material and we want to make sure it has the name and the texture value. So for the name, if we would simply use the name albedo or either emission, that's actually not the true name within the shader. So we're going to have to go to our debug menu. And once we go to our debug menu, if we go under save properties and we click texture, and then we go under emission maps, we can see the name of the actual emission map variable that we need to set. So that's emission maps. So underscore capital E in the emission and capital M in map. So we can just copy and paste that or just type that. So we're going to just paste that into our names. And as far as our value, what we want to use is our ghost texture. We're going to move that into our values. So now let's put everything together. We're going to add right before we get our skin mesh component. So essentially what it's doing now is once it's it's setting our character variable, it's going to go and grab our material from our character variable, and it's going to set it then. And from there, it is going to grab our set material, put this in here, and it's going to set that as the ghost material. So I'm going to click play, and we can see we now have orange ghost. And if we go into our materials, we can see that we now have a material instance of our ghost. So with that in mind, what we're going to do is we're going to change this into the ghost white material. So we're going to have an original ghost. So before we continue, let's first add the components that we're going to need for our enemy character. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a nav mesh agent. So our nav mesh agent is going to help our character navigate the scene. So the only thing that we need to do with our nav mesh agent is change our base offset, our radius, and our height. So once we have our nav mesh agent added, the next thing that we want to do is we want to add a rigid body component. So the only thing that we need to change with our rigid body is to check the is kinematic checkbox. Next, we want to add a capsule collider. And since we have the nav mesh agent as well as the rigid body for our collision, for our capsule collider, we're just going to be using that to detect triggers. So we're going to put on this one is triggers. And once we've done that, we need to make sure that our capsule collider encompasses our enemy. So with our nav mesh rigid body and our capsule collider created, we can move on to creating the other alternative ghost character colors for our prefab. We're going to duplicate our ghosts 4 times, 1 for each color. Now, once we have that done, we need to go and we need to duplicate our macros as well, since if we make a change on one, it will save across all our macros. So we need to make a macro for each of the color of our ghosts. So once we have our macros renamed, let's put the macro on each ghost of the same name. So we're going to put the orange on the orange and so forth. Once that's done, the only thing that we have to do is go into our states and create a material for each of these guys and drag the correct emission within that material. And if we go look at each of these, we can see that we have our unique material in each of these, as well as in our original. And let's hit play to test that out. So we can now see that we have each of our ghosts, each of the correct colors. We only still have that one material that we're using. And additionally, we can also kind of change up the speed of each of their sheets as well. So different things like that, just to add different variety to these characters. But essentially our goal of creating the character's blend shapes as well as adding the color to the material is complete. And the last thing that we need to do is just drag these into our prefab folder, into our character prefab folder, and create a prefab of each of these. So that completes our enemy setup, but be sure to subscribe and join us in the next video where we'll start creating our actual gameplay.